It was 2 o'clock in the morning when Daniel finally felt the pull to head home. After a night filled with drinks and socializing, his energy and patience had worn thin. He knew if he stayed much longer, what had been a pleasant evening could easily go south. Taking the last swig of his beer, he waved goodbye to his friends, ignoring their calls for him to stay just a little longer. Stepping out from the bar's warmth, he wasn't prepared for the sudden chill of the fall air. The walk home was short enough, but tonight, it seemed like it was miles away. He rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself or at least take his mind off the biting cold. Unfortunately, his distraction worked too well, causing him to miss his usual turn off the main road. Before long, he realized he'd gone too far, finding himself at the edge of Willow Park. "Great," he muttered, spotting the large metal archway over the park's entrance. Just as he turned to head back, he heard a faint sound, someone crying in the distance. For a moment, he ignored it and continued walking, but after 2 steps, his conscience tugged at him. He sighed heavily, feeling a pang of regret already, and turned toward the sound. Dragging his feet, he entered the park, following the dirt trail toward the muffled crying. "Hello? Is everything okay?" he called into the darkness, but no response came. The leaves rustled overhead, and his boots crunched against the ground, breaking through the low, soft whimper. He moved further into the park, and the crying grew louder, now a full-blown sob that overpowered every other sound. When he was practically on top of it, he stopped, baffled. There was no one in sight. "Hello?" he shouted again, louder this time. For a split second, the crying halted, and Daniel noticed the faint trickle of water nearby. Somehow, he hadn't realized he was right by the river running through the park. Suddenly, the sobbing turned into an anguished wail that echoed around him. There was no doubt now about where it was coming from. Brushing aside the thick bushes lining the path, he peeked through and caught sight of a woman standing in the middle of the shallow stream, clutching a swaddled baby. She was drenched, her long dark hair plastered to her face. Daniel shivered, his mind reeling at how cold she must be, soaked through in the chilly night. Lost in thought, he shifted his weight, crunching the leaves underfoot. The sound made her head snap around, and he froze as her eyes met his. Startled, he let the bushes fall back, but for that brief moment, he'd caught a glimpse of her face. Something about her bright green eyes unsettled him, sparking a primal unease deep inside. Part of him wanted to turn and leave, but he couldn't bear to abandon the woman and her child in the cold. Hello, do you need any help?" he called, stepping out from behind the bushes. Through her sobs, she mumbled something, too faint for him to understand. He moved closer, trying to reassure her. "It's okay. I'm here to help you. Let's get you out of the water and warmed up." Despite his words, he had no idea how to help her from where he stood on the riverbank. I can't move," she cried helplessly. "Please, take my baby. I can't let her get wet. Promise me you'll keep her safe." She stretched her arms toward him, holding out the bundle. The baby was wrapped so tightly in the blanket that Daniel couldn't see its face, though he could hear the faintest little cries. "Of course, I'll get her out of here. Don't worry." Carefully, Daniel stepped to the edge of the river, his shoes sinking into the muddy bank. Not wanting to go any farther, he leaned in and reached out, gingerly taking the bundle from her arms. As he cradled the child against his chest, he caught a closer look at her eyes and felt an icy shiver crawl up his spine. Her gaze had an unnerving quality, almost animalistic, something close to a predator's stare. Shoving the thought aside, he focused on getting the baby to safety. "Let me put your baby somewhere safe, and I'll come back for you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and comforting, but he could hear his own nerves leaking through. Breaking free from the mud, Daniel hurried back to the path, still clutching the baby. As he took a few steps, he felt his head clear enough to wonder just how the woman ended up stuck in the river like that. Turning back to call out, he saw her head slowly slip under the water, her shadow fading deeper until it disappeared entirely. "Hey! Hey!" he shouted, but all he saw were a few bubbles rising from the calm surface where she had been. He glanced around, desperately hoping someone might come along to help. But the silence was overwhelming, more unnerving than the crying had been. Standing there with the child, he watched as the last bubbles faded away. This couldn't be real, he thought, but the tiny weight in his arms told him otherwise. In those few chaotic seconds, the woman had vanished, leaving him alone with her baby. A pang of sadness and responsibility hit him, even though he'd only just met her. For a second, he considered diving in after her, but he realized the baby wouldn't survive long in the cold without him. The weight of his promise pressed on him, and he knew he needed to find help for the child. He started jogging back down the path he'd come from, careful not to jostle the baby too much. Fueled by adrenaline, the next few minutes flew by as he pushed through the crunching leaves. But then, he slowed, looking around in confusion. Did I miss a turn? He should have been out of the park by now. Even though there was only one path winding through, it felt like he'd been led further in instead of out. Picking up his pace, he went from a brisk walk to a full jog, bouncing the baby lightly. The silence made him nervous, the baby was far too quiet, and he hoped that wasn't a bad sign. As he continued, the air turned colder, and a fog started drifting through the trees, thick and disorienting. Hugging the baby close to keep it warm, he tried to stay calm, but each step only made him more certain he should have found his way out already. He looked for any side path, but there was only the single route winding straight ahead. The fog was thickening, blurring everything in front of him, and he didn't notice the spiderweb stretched across the path until he walked face-first into it. He jumped back, brushing the sticky web off his face. A glance around showed dozens of webs stretched between the trees on either side, covering the path ahead. Grabbing a stick from the ground, Daniel began waving it in front of him to clear away the webs. Before long, thick bundles of spider silk tangled around the end of the stick. The farther he went, the denser the webs became. Normally, he'd be panicking over the idea of spiders everywhere, but he found some strange comfort in not seeing a single one. Maybe even the spiders had enough sense to hide from this cold. Swinging the stick through web after web, he soon had a thick, white-coated branch in his hand. The rhythm of clearing the webs helped settle his nerves, but then his stick suddenly stuck fast, refusing to tear through the next layer. The web in front of him was much tougher than the ones he'd cleared so far. When he couldn't pry the stick free, he hesitated, unsure if he should try to break through it with his hands. In his gut, he felt this had to be the last barrier between him and the park's edge. If he could just break through, he'd be able to find help for the baby. Pushing aside his doubts, he drew back his leg, ready to kick the web out of the way. But before he could go through with it, a loud snort sounded from behind him, echoing through the trees. Startled, he clutched the baby tightly, spinning around to find the source of the noise. Through the fog, a long, pointed gray limb stretched toward me, sending a chill up my spine. When I saw 5 more identical legs slowly creeping forward, I finally understood what I was looking at. A massive gray spider, easily bigger than me, had appeared on the path behind. Cornered by trees and a wall of spiderwebs, there was nowhere to run. The spider lowered itself gracefully through the mist, inching closer until it finally settled on the path in front of me. As it got into position, I found myself face to face with a bull's head, emerging grotesquely from the creature's abdomen. The beast let out a loud, snorting breath that sent a gust of warm air right into my face. Shocked, I nearly lost my grip on the bundle in my arms. Panicking, I held the baby even tighter, then made a desperate move to slip through the small gap between the creature and the thick webs tangled around the trees. But as big as it was, the spider was anything but slow. The instant I lunged forward, it swung its head sideways, and one of its sharp, wide horns slashed across my arm, ripping out a chunk of flesh. Pain tore through me, and I couldn't hold on to the baby any longer. The small, bundled form tumbled to the ground with a soft thud. Reeling from the strike, I staggered, only to find myself hopelessly tangled in the sticky web lining the path. I stretched out my hand, trying to reach the child, but the web held me fast. The baby lay silent and still, eerily quiet for all that had just happened. Ignoring the bundle entirely, the creature turned its focus on me, striding forward as if I was the only thing of interest. One of its spindly legs accidentally brushed the child's bundle, causing it to roll slightly. As it unfurled across the ground, my heart stopped in confusion and dread. There was no baby inside, only a pile of tightly wrapped leaves, scattering in the wind as they spilled out. I frantically replayed every moment from earlier that night, desperate to make sense of any of it. Nothing seemed real, not from the moment I'd stepped into this park. But I didn't have time to think it through. The spider's legs began to move faster, charging straight for me as I struggled in the sticky web. In a flash, it scooped me up on its horns, flinging me high before slamming me back down onto the ground. Pain exploded through my chest as I felt something crack. All I could manage was a shallow, ragged breath, helplessly watching the creature circle back. Its pointed horn jabbed into my chest again, tearing another chunk of flesh. A strangled scream escaped my lips, but I could barely get enough air to stay conscious. My vision began to blur, and in the fading light, I saw her, the woman from the river, approaching from behind the creature. Her walk was strange, her body swaying heavily from side to side. "Have you seen my baby?" she asked, her voice floating through the darkness. She was getting closer, and as she moved, I realized something horrifying: she wasn't walking at all. She was slithering down the path, her bedraggled black hair draped over a snake's body, where her legs should have been. Every instinct in me wanted to scream one last time, but all I could manage was a faint, gasping breath before the creature's massive bull head came crashing down on me once more.